Hey everyone, welcome to Web3 Deep Dive. I'm your host, Rachel Wolfson. This show focuses on real-world Web3 use cases to help you better understand how this technology is being applied today and how it may be applied in the future. If this sounds interesting, please be sure to subscribe to the show so you stay up to date with all of the new episodes. Before getting started with today's episode, I'd like to thank Worsta for making Web3 Deep Dive possible. Worsta is a global technology consultancy with headquarters in Austin, Texas, and Quito, Ecuador. Worsta works with enterprises to help them make sound business decisions on all of their core technologies. And before we get started with the show, I also just want to remind you guys that Web3 Deep Dive is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not offer any forms of financial advice at all. Without further ado, let's dig deep into Web3. Welcome to episode number 5 of Web3 Deep Dive. Joining me today is Zack Guzman. He is the host of Coinage and the founder of Trustless Media. Without further ado, let's get started with the episode. Hey, Zack, how's it going?
Great. Happy to be on, Rachel.
Yeah, welcome to Web3 Deep Dive, and I'm so excited you're here today. And by the way, Zack, before we get started, I also want to say that I have a co-host today. Deanna is joining us as well.
Hey, Zack. Good to see you.
Nice to meet you, Deanna.
Great. So let's get started. So, Zack, you are the host of Coinage, and you are the founder of Trustless Media. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, both of those things.
Okay, wonderful. So today we're going to discuss Web3 and the media sector, and that's kind of exactly what you're doing with Coinage and Trustless. So I guess maybe before we get started, can you explain your role, explain what you've created, and then we can talk a little bit about Web3 and the media.
Yeah, so our whole concept in terms of what Web3 media looks like is basically trying to break down the wall between a content creator and their audience. So the whole idea is what happens when you're able to put a show out there that is co-owned by the audience, aligning those incentives to help something get off the ground natively and grow without the idea of needing, kind of in this context, an intermediary, whether it be a streaming platform or a studio or anything like that. It's really about creating ground up content that can attract a larger and larger audience with that audience built into it. So it's kind of a new concept, but it's very Web3. So I feel like this is the perfect podcast to discuss something like that. And Coinage is our first show, which is essentially decentralized and community-owned content for crypto using NFTs. So I guess the best way to describe it is a mix between Patreon meets a Kickstarter meets verifiable on-chain ownership.
Okay. Wow. That's interesting. So Zack, what I want to know is you've been in the media industry for a very long time. You've been with, was it CNBC that you were a reporter for?
Yeah, I started out at CNBC straight out of college, and then jumped over to Yahoo Finance, where I became an anchor, mostly focusing on crypto.
Okay, got it. So what problems, in your opinion, do you see with traditional media today? And why do you think a Web3 model can solve those problems?
There's a few different problems that I think, Web3 media is solving when it comes to specifically, we can talk about news first. And in news, there's been this phenomenon of bias and mistrust, I think, basically, over the last decade. And the whole concept there is just that how do you know whether or not you can trust these publications and whether or not you believe that personally? I think, that is the objective truth when it comes to mass media today, and certainly the claims of bias out there, right? And the incentives generally do drive that. If you think about Fox News or CNN, regardless of your political views, there are incentives for media outlets to really create sensationalized content, whether it's to chase clicks or to chase the audience. And so the idea of what Web3 media unlocks is changing those, incentive structures to basically, in the context of news, let the community weigh in on what is the objective truth. So it's not just kind of one person's take or one, ideology's take. If you have a decentralized community that can all weigh in, you start to unlock the problem of solving trust in news. And again, also aligning those incentives to where if you have a community of co-owners, who can weigh in on these things, but also stand to gain if you cover things correctly. It aligns those incentives in a way that's different than the old model for media. And that's kind of what we're exploring, at least with our first show, Coinage, in trying to tackle crypto news, because that's a space that I think is uniquely tough to cover, just when it comes to how complex it is. And Rachel, you've been doing this for, I think, even longer than I have. It's complex, and it's also, I think, uniquely attacked or uniquely weak points. There are unique weak points there when it comes to bias in crypto, because everyone assumes you're shilling something when you cover it, or if you have, connections to projects, people don't really believe you. So this is kind of a unique way to remove some of those biases and at least, let a community co-own it and weigh in on what is objective truth.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So when you say community co-own content and that they can weigh in on the news, what exactly do you mean? How does that work?
Yeah, so for us at Coinage, as a community-owned show, we have our NFT holders. They vote basically on what the stories, what's most important for us to chase, what the most important guests are to bring onto the show, and topics that me at CNBC and at Yahoo, certainly I didn't have a team. I don't know if it was the same at Cointelegraph, but I didn't have a team certainly large enough to weigh in on some of these things, nor did I have the network effect necessarily of expertise and sourcing in all kinds of different swaths of topics, right? Because I feel like in crypto, you might be an expert in one thing, you might have sources in one thing, whether it's stable coins, but you're not an expert in Web3 gaming. So what if you can lean on a community that is kind of also an expert in certain niches and have certain connections? And what if you unlock those powers to bring on better guests, or at least maybe tell better stories? And I think that that's kind of one thing where Coinage is working, at least in the crypto sphere, to maybe try these different things out in a way that wasn't necessarily possible, at least unless you wanted to hire a larger and larger staff. And so, we've seen that with the DAO structures in other fields. This is just kind of one way to apply it to crypto media.
So, Zack, you also mentioned aligning incentives with the community. Can you speak more to that and how Web3 helps unlock that piece?
Yeah, so with Web3 media, kind of where we started to see some traction and kind of where this whole idea started was, kind of seeing the next evolution of media. And one of our NFT holders is the co-founder of Netflix. And, he's been pretty instrumental, I think, in kind of the way that we've started to think about this. And Netflix was a company that kind of revolutionized media in the streaming era. But even before they did that, they revolutionized media by sending DVDs in the mail. And you think about how a simple idea like that kind of led to, I guess, streaming for them, and then pioneering that model of what that looks like. And for kind of aligning incentive structures in Web3 media, the whole idea is basically, let's talk about Squid Game, because I think that's a good example, right? There are maybe some people who watched Squid Game early on before it blew up, when it was just a little known Korean show. And they were like, this show is going to blow up. I like it a lot. But, on Netflix, that stuff probably will happen. Those shows will explode if they're good and they're on the platform. It'll gain viewers. But what about if a show's not on Netflix? If you're just starting something out, maybe it spreads by word of mouth. But what if you align those incentives essentially to let someone kind of co-own that show, right? To own a piece of it when it's still early on, or own a piece of a creator that might be blowing up, or at least you see the talent and you say, there's a market for this. I think this show's going to go somewhere. So by aligning those incentives, right? By letting a audience member actually and actively co-own the thing so they can enjoy the upside as it scales and grows an audience, then that incentive is aligned to kind of share either the content or tell more friends about it, to where that show can blow up with or without a Netflix. And so that's one thing that I think was super exciting to see the co-founder of Netflix understand. When you start to align these incentives, you kind of unlock some of those network effects and the ability for a new show that might not have a huge audience right off the bat to go a bit more viral when you kind of let the audience enjoy in the upside.
How do the audience, how are they co-owners of Coinage? How does that work?
Yeah, so this is cool. I mean, the reason why I quit, I guess, at Yahoo when I was looking at community ownership of media, right? music was kind of the first thing to unlock the idea of shared royalties, right? And this idea of co-ownership. There were a lot of music platforms where you could buy a song and share in the royalties of that song as an artist gains traction, like Royal, Sound XYZ, and a few others in music. And I was like, well, what if you applied that model to TV? And obviously TV and music are two very different things. And, there were a couple things we needed to figure out because we wanted to do this in the US and we wanted it to be legal. And so the structure we landed on was essentially, if you buy an NFT, it's your ticket into the Coinage cooperative, which is where all the IP for Coinage is housed. And so when you buy that NFT, it's essentially a membership pass. And that membership pass allows you to join the cooperative and co-own the show that way. And because we are a legally registered cooperative in the state of Colorado, it also unlocks the piece that I think is missing in a lot of NFT communities today, which is the ability to unlock dividends back to our NFT holders who are active and weighing in on the show. And it took months to kind of set that up. But I think that is a key value unlock in a way that allows these things, and cooperatives have been around forever, by the way, and legally recognized in the US. So it's kind of a unique structure to say, look, you literally co-own this show because that's where it's housed. It's in this cooperative DAO, essentially. And yeah, it's been fun to see kind of people start to realize it's real co-ownership, which is very different than just, I guess, collectibles. And we can get into that because there are differing views on what NFT should serve as in media.
Right, definitely. It's an interesting model. Now, are there an unlimited amount of NFTs where anybody can say, hey, I want to be a part of this, I just buy an NFT? Or do you guys have 200 of those where only 200 people are allowed to be co-owners?
Yeah, so when we started out, we were really trying to figure out the tier system in kind of, how do you set this up if you're really getting it off the ground? Because obviously, as I said, when you're mixing elements of Kickstarter and Patreon, there are elements of a show needs money to, produce itself. And how do you set that up? And so, we landed on the idea of a tier structure where we have NFTs that essentially just unlock subscriptions, right? And so we were kind of one of the first media entities to throw out NFTs as your login, right? You might log in the New York Times, you might have a Netflix subscription, but we had a base tier for that where you could sell that on the open market and that was your subscription. And then we have two ownership tiers, which are, as I was describing, kind of the way to actually co-own the show. And, one is lower than the other one, and it allows people to kind of enter this community at whatever price point they want. And the distinction there, Rachel, is that, both of them, one tier is 5,000 NFTs, the other one's 1,000 NFTs, but both of those tiers own the same split of the co-op. So essentially, it's more people splitting the same slice of the pie, essentially. So that's kind of how we justify two different price points there. But at the end, again, a DAO co-op, so all the money from these mints go directly to supporting the show, supporting Coinage, and letting us tell, these stories that might not get told elsewhere.
Got it. Deanna, any thoughts there that you want to ask Zack about?
Yeah, I'm eager to hear your position. You mentioned NFT ownership versus part of the community. What do you think the rub is there among folks who are maybe hesitant to own NFTs?
I feel like everyone we hear from is always generally kind of a little worried about what they're getting when they buy an NFT, right? And you wouldn't necessarily care about that if you're only buying something to flip it. And I think, anytime you have a new asset, there are going to be people who are speculating on things. I think in the early days of crypto with Bitcoin and Ether, there were certainly people who were just traders. But I think as some of this stuff has established itself, you start to see people who come in who want to buy something and hold it, right? And particularly for NFTs that have utility, those are different than just kind of art or, I guess, something that doesn't have utility. And as we've seen the whole space, as we've seen NFTs mature, I think you're starting to see people wonder what they can unlock with some of these things, right? Beyond just speculation, what else can you do? And there have been a lot of NFT projects now that have moved past that into kind of community and the network effects that come with them, whether it's, in our case, unlocking special content or being able to see content first or voting on that content to kind of just, collaborations with other communities in a Web3 native way. And so, yeah, I mean, kind of the possibilities there are endless. But for us, it's just been really fun to see, what our community members, want us to cover, but also what role does Coinage serve in the broader space? And, that comes from treasury votes. What do we want to do with the funds that we raise? Should we do anything that's, as crazy as throwing our treasury into Doge, which did not pass in one of our first community votes?
I saw that, by the way.
Yeah, it didn't happen, even though I wanted it.
It didn't pass, darn.
I know, it didn't pass. But that's kind of what happens, right? If something's really decentralized and it's not all one person's call, it's not my call, it's, what the community wants.
Zack, so I have a question. Because, you said that it can unlock special content if people hold the NFTs, correct? How is this different than just gated content? If somebody subscribes to a media outlet and then they get access to the full article, for instance. So I just want to know why you chose this model versus that traditional model where it's like, oh, if you subscribe to the show, you actually get access to the full episode. Why did you choose to do this whole gated content with NFTs versus just traditional?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I feel like, a lot of this is an active experiment, right? When it comes to the idea of having your subscriptions be NFTs that trade openly on the market, that's a radical concept that I don't think like a New York Times or Netflix would want to do now. But as an entity that's just getting off the ground, again, it goes back to kind of those value incentives of, this subscription, if it's capped, right? And that's something that, our community will vote on, is if it's capped and there are only, say, 5,000 New York Times subscriptions that were ever minted at the onset of the New York Times, and that traded freely, technically that value capture wouldn't necessarily go back to the New York Times. It would go back to the first people who supported the platform that made the New York Times the New York Times. And that's kind of what we've been able to do here at Coinage, right? With our first drop, we had about 6,000 people mint NFTs in our first season. And, as we changed the price from being free, which it was in the first season, to being not free in the second season, the people who had already minted that and supported us and kind of got Coinage off the ground, those are your first users. Those are your first viewers. It's kind of a radical concept to reward them in a way. But again, I think it accelerates the adoption of any news outlet because, it adds an element of, again, ownership. And those NFT holders are still able to weigh in and unlock content, as I said. So yes, it could have probably been, a traditional login, obviously. But when you start to add those elements of co-ownership, no different than what we've seen, in crypto, you start to accelerate the cold start problem. And so, so it's been a fascinating experiment. And I don't even think a lot of people who minted our first NFTs know that that's coming. But that's what we have slated in May, is this idea of really starting to accelerate it and letting those people who minted those for free now also mint the co-ownership tier at half price before anyone else gets the chance to. So again, it's all about rewarding, your first viewers, anyone who kind of, supports a show. A show in any world, whether it's Web3 or Web2, is literally only as powerful as the audience it's able to attract, right? The Tonight Show wouldn't be the Tonight Show if people didn't watch it. So that's kind of the concept, and something that I think we're excited to pioneer. And there's no guarantee it's going to work, right? I think there's no guarantee that anything in Web3 works, but I think that this is an experiment that at least is delivering on the concept and the whole high ordeals of decentralizing and co-ownership when it comes to media.
Definitely. I agree. I mean, I like how, you're very realistic about it. It's an experiment. We don't know if it's going to work because, Zack, my main concern is it's a very appealing concept and model, I think, to crypto natives. But how are you going to attract the mainstream? How are you going, some people, they don't want to be involved with NFTs at all. They hear NFTs, they get scared. They hear wallets, they're like, what do I do? So how are you, do you want to attract the mainstream to this type of model? I guess that's my question.
No, it's a great question. And it's one that we are kind of, dealing with, just as every other crypto company deals with, this idea of adoption when the onboarding is terrible, right? When the onboarding is way clunkier than I just want to use a credit card and buy this thing. So we've added some of those elements, right? And we've certainly suffered from some of the drawbacks of that too. Duke behavioral economist professor Dan Ariely is one of our NFT holders as well. one of the smartest guys when it comes to incentive structures. And the dude minted one, and then he lost his seed phrase and then lost his NFT. And so what am I supposed to tell him when it comes to, hey man, thanks for minting this thing for like $1,000 and now you lost it? It's not exactly a good selling point to anyone else trying to think about whether or not they want to own this show. So, I mean, it's an active problem, but it's an active problem across the board in Web3. But to answer your question, right, when you think about that concept of co-owning media, like, I think these are solutions that will be solved. We ourselves, as I said, are adding kind of credit card onboarding. And, you know, it's also the fact that not everyone's super into a crypto show, right? They could be into the idea of co-owning their favorite show, but they don't care at all about crypto. So our whole concept is basically trying to use the crypto community and people who are interested in crypto, maybe Web3 native already, who are going to go along with some of those pain points to prove out the concept, right, of what's possible here. And I think we're seeing that across the board. A lot of Web3 things are starting out with the people who actually know how to mint, know how to set up a wallet, but they have goals of onboarding the masses, right? Whether it's Web3 social, whether it's Web3 music, or in our case, Web3 TV, you kind of start with the people you think are going to convert and expand from there. So Coinage is the proof of concept show. We don't want to just be crypto shows. We want to expand into co-owned travel, co-owned politics, whatever it may be, whatever comes next. And so I think that that's kind of where the future of media heads. And again, you got to start somewhere. And so, yes, it's tricky.
Yeah. All of that makes sense for sure. You've got to start somewhere. I mean, Deanna, you obviously know, like you're in charge of the Worsted Web3 arm. What are your thoughts on that? Just experimenting with Web3 and starting and.
Yeah, definitely. I think framing it as a proof of concept is an interesting way to put it. And the fear in that is what happens when it goes wrong, right? Which we've been seeing a lot lately over the past 6 months, I'd say. And so if it's a proof of concept where there's limited losses, right, a do no harm type of mentality, right? Either way, you're going to put out some great content and folks will have value exchanged from that. Then I think it's a really powerful proof of concept. I'm interested to transition to talk a little bit more about some experience you have with some failed crypto proof of concepts. Let's say.
Yeah, Zach, can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, have you had any failed proof of concepts that you've thought, you know, maybe if I do it a certain way, you know, these things will be successful?
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like, you know, anytime you're building on the frontier of new stuff, you get a lot of things wrong. And certainly when we were starting out, right, like I said, we had about 6,000 people mint our free NFTs last year. And didn't collect emails, really leaned in the idea of being a Web3 company, didn't collect any information on those people, which at the time was great because it's like, oh yeah, we're going full Web3. But now as we try to contact them to let them know that there's this huge opportunity to actually co-own what we're building in the month of May as we drop these NFTs, the next tier up, there's no way to get back at them, right? And so again, it's like, how Web3 do you want to be? And where are the trade-offs, right? And adoption. And I was just talking with the founder of Solana, Anatoly Yakovenko, and even he is kind of in the same boat, right? When they launched their phone, it's like, how Web3 do we want to be when a lot of the Web2 ways to pay are a lot easier, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't have the same security. So where do you draw that line? And so, yeah, for us, you know, it's again a question of how Web3 do we really want to be as kind of a pioneer in this space? To your point, do we want everything to be kind of content unlocked using NFTs, or do we want to be more traditional in the media space? And so, I mean, these are questions every founder has to ask themselves, but, you know, it's been fun as a journalist to cover these from the outside looking in and now be building in the space. You realize these are not easy decisions, especially if you want to be targeting a mainstream audience, right? It's really tough.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because I've heard that same challenge with other Web3 founders where they do an NFT launch. People buy the NFTs if there's a physical product associated with that, for instance, and the physical product is ready and they're going to ship that. They don't have the shipping information. They don't have any information because it's just wallet addresses. And so while I think using NFTs is a great concept for different Web2 models, we still need to think about these challenges because if we don't have information to contact people, then how are we going to get in touch with them when, you know, like Zack, if there was a physical element of Coinage, how are you going to send that out to people?
Yeah, we've since rectified, I think, some of that collection when it comes to email or being able to contact them a little bit more. But, again, I think the concept of building in this space, any founder is probably pretty sold on the idea of this space not going away, right? And so if your whole business model is trying to attract a certain audience, right, and it's the base layer is that this person is into crypto, and then tangentially you can go off in any spoke there. So they're into crypto and they're into media and they're into co-owning media. Once you build up that base layer, you have that network, right? So for us, it's like, all right, we'll build out Coinage. We'll have a network of people who have minted our NFTs. And then for the second or third or fourth show, you can kind of extrapolate from there and use that network effect. And that's something that I think, a lot of people in media are starting to realize that becomes pretty powerful if you actually own your audience, right? For sequels, for studios, for whatever, if you can somehow market your product to people that already were so in love with your other show, whatever it may be, that they're going to love this second or third or fourth show that's attached to that. So, there are a lot of different things, but all of this information and technology is being built on the fly too. So there's already kind of some interesting ways to reconnect with past mentors, or at least dig into Web3 analytics that we've been exploring, and a lot of startups working on that too. So I feel like we're moving in the right direction, but clearly, I guess, not all those tools are as robust as the Facebooks or the Instagrams or the Googles that advertisers love in Web2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a ton of opportunities there. I wonder, when you're saying pitching it to other media companies, do you think that your community is more engaged or more sticky or more active because they own a piece of the company than they would if they were just a passive participant?
Yeah, I think we've seen that. It's been exciting because, again, we've been around for less than a year, but it's been cool to see guests come in as a viewer, not actually even know that they can co-own this show, and then start to join the Discord and weigh in on topics and weigh in on guests. Just last week, we had someone weigh in on our whole topic, which was DAOs and the future of work. And he came on and essentially pitched the whole episode, and we went out and produced it. And now he's like, wait a minute, I can co-own this too. So it's been cool to start to see that realization. And like I said, I can certainly book guests, but in certain areas, I don't know anyone at all. I don't have any connections there. So, if they realize, oh, wait, I can make the show better and it benefits me. It's been fun to start to see those gears turn in our little audience and on our network as it's grown. And it's been, again, that's not possible necessarily in Web2 media. And so it's been something that people, even in our community, are slowly realizing.
Yeah, I love that, Zack, because it is important. I mean, obviously, Web3 Deep Dive is a new show. This is episode 5. And it's important to connect with your audience and know who they are and allow them to actually have say in the show. And I'm trying to think of ways like, how do I do that outside of just social media stuff, outside of these Web2 social media platforms? So I do think what you're doing with Coinage is great. I also want to say that when I went to see, it was an interview on Coinage, and I basically connected my wallet and then I got access to the entire interview. I thought that was super cool. I mean, it's really just like, I'm a subscriber, basically. I put in my login information and there's the interview, but this is like you connect your wallet and you have the interview. So I think it was really easy to do, is what I'm saying. I want the mainstream to know it is really easy once you figure it out.
Well, thank you for that endorsement, because, yeah, I mean, I guess we're betting on, right, if we're not collecting any of that data or anything like that, when people just use their wallet to log in, right, I guess we're betting on the fact that maybe some people in Web3 will be, either impressed or excited by that technology being applied to everyday things, that they'll tell people about it, essentially, right? And I guess that's working. If you liked it that much, then hopefully that's really what's happening. Because, again, like I said, when we first set out, we didn't really collect any info. So we didn't hear any of those compliments. So it's nice to hear. And I think we've since rectified a little bit of that for new mentors. But yeah, I mean, it's just, again, I feel like a lot of people have been searching for utility and certain things that are just easy, like logging into a website. And it's like a simple thing. But it's something that I think once people realize it and see it in practice, it's like, oh, wow, all right, we might be onto something in this utility NFT world.
Yeah, I think people just need to try it out and see how easy it is, because I've been in the industry since 2017 and I've seen, different trends and things within the industry. And it is new. It is new to me. Web3 is new, and it's very easy once you get the hang of it. I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to ask you about the Do Kwon interview that you did. Do Kwon is the founder of Terraform Labs. Is that correct? He's the one behind that was behind the Terra Luna stablecoin, and he was a guest on. Was it your first episode? I'm not sure.
Yeah, he was. We were not set up. I had quit my job. I had quit Yahoo in February, and we had barely, gotten set up here and, chased the Do Kwon interview like everybody else in media. And it came through. We were not ready. The site was not built. And I slept on the floor with the team here trying to edit that one. So yeah, it was a big premiere for us, shall we say, and it kind of set off everything. But it was a wild story, and I think it's one that still everyone in crypto has evolving views on as we learn more about Terra. And yeah, it was pretty wild, shall we say.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you even got that interview? I mean, I know, he probably wouldn't talk to me. He probably, wouldn't want to come on Cointelegraph and talk about himself, but somehow you managed to get him to come on Coinage.
Yeah, there are a lot of different things there. So for one, at Yahoo, I've been covering Terra for a while, and he and I had established a relationship because he had come on my show at Yahoo to talk about Terra. And I think, again, this is one of those things where Terra was serving a mission, right? Its whole idea was a decentralized economy needs decentralized money. That sucked a lot of people in, including myself, who put their money into that project because the concept was true. It's like, what are we all doing here if we're trusting centralized stablecoins? We need a decentralized stablecoin. And, from an investor's perspective, that made a lot of sense because the premise was super simple and a lot of money flowed into the Terra ecosystem. The thing that I started to realize, though, Rachel, while I was covering it and after I quit Yahoo, was that there were serious problems with that project, and serious problems that a lot of people in traditional finance had been flagging. Essentially that it's really hard to peg any currency to a dollar unless you have a bunch of money to back it up. And even then, once people realize exactly how much money you have, they just need more than that to take it down. And so I woke up to that fact. I think a lot of people had been shouting about it. But again, how do you trust anyone in crypto, really? And so anyone who had raised problems with Terra basically got shouted down and cast aside as just a Terra short seller. And so that was kind of where the concept of Coinage even came about, was what can we do as a media entity if we're able to bring in people who are both pro Terra and against Terra and, dig into something like that. And so it's an interesting concept, but, for Do, it was one that I had been covering for a long time and basically been waiting for. And then after the collapse, chased for months. In addition to that, we were supposed to talk the day before Terra collapsed. We had lined up an interview to dig into all these problems that I had been sourcing, and we were supposed to chat. And as things unwound, basically that interview got canceled. And so it was a blessing and a curse. At the time, I was like, oh, God, this is tough. Like, I really wanted this interview, but now it canceled because this whole project melted down. But at the same time, that basically gave us a head start on chasing the first interview after the collapse, which wound up being even bigger because, like you said, everybody was chasing that one. And so we went to Singapore. It took a lot of convincing, I think, to get him to agree to the idea of doing an interview. We told that story in a way that appealed to mainstream viewers who might not know anything about Terra. And, we learned a lot that eventually came out in, the SEC filing against Terraform Labs and Do Kwon and everything else that's kind of come out since. So, that I think is a good example of exactly where Coinage wants to be when it comes to trying to tackle the truth behind some of these things. And, whether or not you believe the headlines that came out around it, it's a tricky one. And we've seen so many people kind of be on one camp being like, yeah, decentralized project is good. Even if it fails, they're at least trying to do something. And they have other people saying, no, this was a fraud from the get-go. And so, it's been an interesting story to tell. and one that I think, we as a community owned show, we're excited to kind of get to tell first.
Yeah, that's really impressive that you were able to get that interview and right at the right time. I think a lot of folks who are skeptical on crypto, the headline they hear is just another major scam in crypto, right? From your time with Do Kwon and all that you know about it, how would you distill what happened for someone who's not familiar and only hears the scam in crypto headline?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because how do you distill it down? Essentially, it was just big picture, not even in crypto. It was like an Elizabeth Holmes story, right? And you might not believe that, because could it have been a fraud from the get-go? Could Elizabeth Holmes have been a fraud from the get-go? Like, she was building towards something. And so I guess, a lot of people have looked at the collapse of Terra, and it was, again, a huge ambitious project to build something that had never been built before, a decentralized stablecoin. The idea of putting a dollar on chain without having to need assets to back it up. And a lot of people have connected those dots and saying, there's no difference between that and the actual US dollar. Gold doesn't back up the dollar anymore either. But you've got a little thing called the government that's able to print more and more money whenever they see issues, right? And Terra did not have that. And that's a pretty important concept in crypto when you have panic. And so yeah, I feel like that's one of those things where it's crypto as a technology has so much promise. And so many people are thinking that this technology can completely change the world. But there are still limitations when you start putting technology into the world of finance. And there are still a lot of, human characteristics like panic that drive people to take their money back out of something. And I think we learned that with Terra's collapse. Sometimes these missions might be good, but good missions are very different than missions that work. And, how far a founder is willing to go to try and get people to believe in that mission can be tricky. And in the case of what we're about to see when it comes to that being prosecuted, can also be illegal. So those are things that I think the whole entire world learned when it comes to these things, is that, high promise equals high risk. And, it's on everybody to kind of figure that one out when it comes to what's real, not just in crypto, but I think, everything in the world.
Right. That's a great way of explaining it. I was also wondering, did the audience of Coinage vote to have Do Kwon on the show, or was it just that you had this connection with him? Terra had collapsed, you wanted to do the interview, or was there actually a vote at that time to have him on?
Yeah, no. So this has kind of been, an increasingly decentralized project, just like all of them are, right? It's kind of set up at the beginning. It was just us running kind of where this was, starting Coinage from a brand concept perspective. And now increasingly, as we've added these NFTs and set up the cooperative, it's now kind of, its own entity. So at the time, it was still just us kind of getting set up. So at that point, no, it hadn't been voted on. But now, ever since we started our first community vote, everything else has been voted on, whether it's governance or episode topics or guests. We've moved in that direction now. And again, that's really where this cooperative piece is important, because you can only unlock patronage dividends in a cooperative if you're actively participating. You can't kind of do that otherwise. Otherwise, it's just an investment. And so that, I think, is kind of where DAOs and cooperatives are generally pretty much aligned in step, because cooperatives only work if people are actually working together to do something in a mission. And so that's kind of where we're heading at Coinage, is this idea of, all right, we're only as good as the work that we're all able to put into this now. And so we have, again, a bunch of members throwing topics out there, throwing ideas out there, and now we're moving in that direction. But no, at the time, the Terra story was just us doing that one.
Yeah, well, I can't wait until I see SBF on your show, Sam Bankman-Fried. I vote for that one.
Yeah, everybody seems to be chasing that one. And I don't know, he doesn't seem to be talking as much anymore. So,
well, you should talk to Tiffany. Shout out to Tiffany, by the way, who's a friend of mine. She knows SBF. And maybe she can help facilitate getting him on your show.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's kind of the concept. If we have a bunch of other people who are owning this with us, then maybe that becomes more possible. But yeah, I don't know. It's always tricky, because again, it's like, as a journalist, how do you get these people on? Sourcing's hard.
It is hard. And I think, like you said, Zach, connections are everything. You had a relationship with Do. And it's like me, the people that come on Web3 Deep Dive, I've got a relationship with them. It's all about that, I think. And I think it's really cool what you're doing, because if you know someone who's a part of Coinage, who is a part of that ownership, and if they know someone, they can help source that, which is great for a media outlet, in my opinion, get more interviews.
Yeah, I think that's a concept that, again, we've seen the network effects, and it's no different than Bitcoin or Ethereum, right? It's like all these communities want to build in their own ecosystem because it benefits them, right? If you're an Ethereum token holder, you want to build in ETH, and if you're a Solana token holder, you want to build in Solana. But what happens when you put a show on chain, right? And I think it's particularly easy to think about from a news perspective, like you just said, you and me. But I don't know. I don't know what that looks like when you move into travel, right? If you're a jurisdiction where you want a lot more US tourists and you have a show that focuses on travel destinations, does it make sense to co-own that show and pitch? I think it unlocks a bunch of different things in a way that, again, in the Web2 world of thinking, a lot of people think in one-way streets. Like your customer's only a customer, but what happens if you break that wall down and all of a sudden they're not just a customer anymore, but you can start to unlock all kinds of network effects? And I think, we're seeing that across the Web3 ecosystem. Is what happens when our airline mile rewards member is also a Lyft rewards member, and we can use these things in very interesting marketing ways that people hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, that's really great, Zach. You're tying it all together, right? The network effect, cooperative, where all incentives are aligned, trying to help people understand how this is different, how Web3 actually enables a media business where your customer is not just a customer. I think you've distilled that down for us really well. And even the difference, maybe you can restate it again, the difference between cooperative business, which has been around forever, and this new Web3 enabled DAO model. What's the big difference there?
I think the biggest difference, right, in terms of any entity, right, when you think about a DAO and decentralizing ownership, is just the idea of unlocking people that might have been just static consumers into builders, right? And the idea of aligning those incentive structures to create something that's even more powerful than the old system. And again, I go back to the example of media in Web 2 was just a one-way street, right? You create something, you grow an audience, you sell ads against it, and that's a means to an end. Essentially, you're using your viewer as a means to an end. In a Web3 media model, though, you basically start to bring your viewer in, and they become co-owners. And as it scales, they have an incentive to tell their friends, to share clips, to do whatever, to get something off the ground because they own it. And it unlocks a totally different way of thinking. They're no longer a means to an end, but they're the end in and of themselves. And that's an interesting unlock that I think, again, solves the cold start problem and draws them in to build something that may have been better than what, a small group of writers or a small group of creators would have been able to build, right? It's like, everyone goes back to Uber and the idea of what would have happened if you tried to create something where it was a two-way street and not just a centralized company saying, all right, you're going to work for us, you're going to drive for us, we're going to take X%, but it was kind of co-owned by the drivers or anyone who wanted to add that, right? How quickly would Uber have been able to grow? So it's an interesting concept, but I feel like that is kind of the biggest difference between DAOs, co-ops, and the old way of thinking.
It is an interesting concept, and you explain it very well. My question is this, and this is with every model. There are challenges, right? And so in terms of having community members also co-own Coinage, how can we ensure that the news that they're voting upon is legitimate news? And that's a huge problem we're seeing today, right? Like, we don't want fake news on a media outlet. But if you've got people in your community that are bad actors, and again, this can also apply to Uber. If the driver is a bad actor, something dangerous can happen to the rider. So if someone in your community is a bad actor and you produce news that isn't legitimate, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of, I guess, again, the trade-off in terms of co-ops and DAOs, the idea of how much control do you want to give up? If you give up full control, you might run into that issue, and it is a problem. I think it's been interesting to see governance structures be set up to where, you've got essentially things that kind of look like the democracy we have here in the US in terms of representative membership, right? So certain people stake or delegate to certain people on a board, and then that board decides, all right, what should we be doing here, right? And that's kind of how some of these DAOs have started to evolve into governance structures that look like that. So it's still kind of, you have people voting on it, but you have those checks and balances. And particularly in the way that we set Coinage up, a lot of my problems with a bunch of these DAOs or NFT projects is the communities are essentially handpicked by whoever sets the project up. They control a whitelist, they add people to that whitelist, and then it winds up being all their friends are in this community. For us at Coinage, we basically designed a structure where people get to invite the next people that come in. So if you mint, you earn invites, and you can invite the next group of people in. And the reason we did that is we didn't want just one kind of type of thinking, right? We wanted different and competing interests in our community. So it wasn't just going to be a show that was owned by Solana or Terra or whatever it may be. We wanted to have a bunch of different communities co-owning this with us. And so we were pretty methodical from the outset to do something like that, where it wasn't just even who I wanted in this community. It's literally out of my hands who gets invited after I mint. And so that was kind of, one of those concepts that from day one we wanted to decentralize this. But it's a really good point, because you can easily see how this would start to replicate the same problems of, Web2 media if all you are is an echo chamber, and all you wind up doing is spitting the same views back into the world that everyone had before. And so that's really where, trying to do this slowly, trying to be methodical. We're about a year into it, trying to attract the right community members and co-owners has been pretty important to really the success or failure of Coinage. And again, like you said, it's an experiment. So there's no guarantee that it pans out. But I think that if you're trying to build with those ideas in mind, it hopefully looks a little bit better than if I hand selected everybody, or if, we had just one type of viewer or one kind of, I guess, ideological thing in mind, right? So we want to be a decentralized show exactly for that reason.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You also mentioned, Zach, before we started the interview, and I just wanted to ask you about this. There's a divide between the NFT community and the crypto community. I thought that was interesting because you are a crypto-focused show that has NFTs associated with it. What do you mean that there's a divide between the NFT community and the crypto community?
Yeah, it's been really weird, right? Even internally, when we're discussing story ideas, it's like some people are really into NFTs and they're here for the culture. Or you even got into crypto because of an NFT that your favorite artist put out, and it's because of the culture. But then you've got people who are really into it for the technology, who maybe started in, really digging into ETH and have been in the space for a long time. And then they went to Solana and they've been looking at the technology of all this, or they're super interested in the tokens themselves. So they're really only here to make money as traders, and they could care less about culture in NFTs. And so I don't know, it's kind of like it sucked all these people into Web3 as a catch-all, I guess. But you've got people who are really here because of crypto, and then you got people who are really here because of NFTs and the idea of the culture aspect to Web3. And so I don't know, from where I sit, I've seen a lot of different, audience members and interests as we source all these stories and weigh all these things. And it's wild to think that you could have those two different kind of types of viewers and demographics in Web3. But I don't know, you got people who, knew all about Solana NFTs, but never heard of Anatoly before, the co-founder of Solana. So I it's just kind of, there are a lot of different interests, I guess, is all that goes to show, is that you've got a lot of people who are interested in Web3 and what this technology stands for in terms of decentralizing ownership and aligning interests and incentives. But that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And you're left with, a very interesting, I guess, bifurcation of people who are into crypto but don't know NFTs and vice versa, which is fine. It's whatever people care about.
Right. Well, Coinage, do you think that we'll see Coinage ever venturing into mainstream, or will it just always be a crypto-focused show? Or does that just depend?
Yeah, I think Coinage was, from the outset, really square and focused on crypto, right? But again, as a show that's co-owned by its audience, it's not necessarily up to me what stories we want to tell. And so if that expands from just being crypto to being tech or fintech or AI, that's something that I think will be up to our NFT holders in terms of where this goes from here. But, the other thing too is Coinage as a concept essentially is now out in the world as an experiment. So when it comes to scaling, if there's a distribution deal and a network wants to pick up Coinage, that could be a huge game changer for our community. And the idea of that happening might edge some people in a direction, right? If their interests are, hey, I'm an NFT holder, I control the Coinage IP, there's a deal out there, Netflix wants a show that's more on fintech, and they're looking at Coinage, then I'd probably vote in that direction if I stand to benefit from it. So, it starts to unlock a whole bunch of different things. And I can't really say it's too early, but I do think, as you know, Rachel, that there are waves of interest in crypto. And I think we're kind of nearing the bottom after 2022, and we're starting to see interest come back. So that might dictate kind of where the focus and attention of Coinage goes to.
Right.
That's so interesting. You as the creator and initial owner cannot tell us the future because the community dictates the future.
Yeah, I guess if I was able to say exactly where Coinage goes, it wouldn't be very decentralized. So that is one thing. At the same time, I'm terrified because you build this thing and you start it and you're like, I don't really know what happens next, right? And again, we have certain control over these things as a DAO, as a cooperative, as it gets built up. And we kind of iron out the governance structure. But no, it very much is, what does our community of NFT holders want this to be? And yeah, that's a question I single-handedly cannot answer. I can't even get us to put our treasury into Doge, so it shows how much I can do.
Right. Were you for that, by the way? Did you want the treasury to be put into Doge?
Yeah, I was for it. And I thought, if you look at the price of Doge since I put that out there, it's up. And so I feel vindicated a little bit. But nice. I guess, as a treasury asset, you don't really think in scales of weeks. You think in scales of years. So maybe there's something to be said about why that vote went the way it did. But I don't know. Doge is always one of those weird ones where it's like, yeah, people think it's a joke or they think it's a meme, but it's actually outperformed depending on what time scale you look at and how different is it really from a Bitcoin or an Ether. It's the same network effects. And so, you remove Elon's pumping from the equation, it's still a crypto just like any other. So I don't know. I thought that was a vote that was an interesting gut check, heat check on our audience. And alas, it did not pass.
Yeah. No, that is interesting. I also think, and we're going to wrap things up here, but I do think it's interesting, Zack. I feel like all Web3 projects are an experiment at this point, and we need to recognize that. These are models that can change different industries, for instance, the media industry, but we're experimenting. We're in that phase, and if something works and it sticks, then that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest lesson I tell anybody who's looking at Web3 or crypto is if anyone's guaranteeing success, if anyone's guaranteeing profits, you should immediately run in the other direction because there are no guarantees in this world we live in, right? But if someone's offering you the chance to, hey, look, we're building something, we're experimenting with co-owned media. What does it look like when you can actually co-own one of your favorite shows and scale something and actually see legitimate upside? Then, I think that's an interesting offering. And, it's one, again, I don't know where this goes, but I think, the attraction that we've seen thus far, having the co-founder of Netflix as a co-owner, having John Woo from Avalanche as a co-owner, and a bunch of other Web3 founders, I feel like, we're on to something because we've been able to attract them and we've been able to deliver on the mission of, creating something that is now being voted on by our community. And hopefully putting out good enough content that also still at the end of the day is really where we win or lose. And that I think has been the secret sauce that thus far, hopefully, allows us to continue this little experiment we've got going on. But it's been fun. And it's been fun to see people from all over the world kind of get into our Discord and again, weigh in on topics and guests and increasingly have this be out of my hands. So, it's been fun. And you're right. There is no guarantee here, but I think it's one thing that I wanted to see for myself after covering it for so long is if you actually commit to those ideals, what can happen? If you break down the wall between a creator and their audience, what can you unlock? And I think Coinage is about to find that out.
Yeah, I love that. Wonderful. Any final thoughts, Deanna? Do you want to ask Zack anything before we end the interview? This has been wonderful so far. So.
Yeah, no, this has been really great. I think even your final line there was so perfect. I think that's the headline. Right? If
that's the ending factor for this interview. I think it's a great way to end the interview. But Zack, actually, before we end, how can our listeners get in touch with you or how can they find out more about Coinage? Just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, for sure. So interestingly, we're kind of chatting at the perfect time because in May 8th is when we're turning subscriber NFT minting back on. So if anyone is interested in what Coinage is doing in terms of this experiment, you can go to coinage.media to mint an NFT, which will allow you to then mint our co-ownership tier at half price. So coinage.media, we're also on YouTube, Coinage Media, where you can check out our content, follow our videos, our stories, but also, importantly, Rachel, as we said, co-own what we're building as well. So hopefully if anyone's listening, if anyone's interested in Web3 media, we're kind of a project that is proving out what this can look like and would love to hear from your viewers as well.
Got it. Hear that, viewers? Zack wants your feedback. Okay, awesome. Zack, it was such a pleasure. Deanna, I'm so glad that you joined us. This has been really great, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you, Zack.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rachel. Appreciate it, and hopefully we can see each other in Austin at some point. We could be there in person.
For sure. Thanks, Zack.